Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of the Omnist Hour. As I promised yesterday, we are going to be touching on the topic of Antichrist today. That's been on a lot of people's mind. And I'm going to focus on giving you the Omnist take on this. I think I'm going to title the episode, Will the Real Antichrist Please Stand Up? I think that kind of gets to the heart of the issue. Everybody seems to have a different idea of what and who Antichrist is. I'm going to try to elucidate that, help you understand it in the context of a greater picture, the omnist way of doing things, stepping back a little bit and doing things from a broader perspective, not negating other perspectives, but maybe looking from a little bit higher viewpoint to integrate multiple viewpoints into something that makes more sense as a whole. Okay, so let's start out with the word Antichrist. Antichrist is the opposite. Anti means opposite of Christ. Okay, well, we don't even know what opposite is, but as we've talked about before, it's hard to define an opposite without defining the thing that it's opposite to. And so the crux of the issue really centers in many, many different understandings of what Christ is. So let's back up and look at this word Christ. Now, if you look at the Greek etymology of this word, you will realize that it means Christ, comes from the word Christus, which means anointed. Not anointed one, just anointed. And in fact, this word came to be associated in religious terms with the mystery cults, the Greek mystery cults of Eleusis, and apparently was also tied to, according to the founding fathers of Athens, whose much of whose knowledge was passed down by Plato, the one who passed us down the Atlantis story, in fact, also made some comments about how the mysteries of Eleusis were tied to origins or linkages between the Athenian city-state and the Egyptian civilization, and knowledge that was brought to Athens from Egypt that made Athens the centerpiece of intellectual thought that it became. And this has some interesting corollaries. One little known fact is that one of the episodes of the Peloponnesian War, the long war between Athens and Sparta that sort of ended the golden age of Athens, was an aborted invasion of Egypt, ostensibly to defend the Greek colonies in the coast of Cyrenaica, the coastal area next to Egypt, where there had been a lot of settlement by Greek settlers from many city-states, including Athens. Okay, so there was a long history of ties between these older civilizations, between their religious traditions. And if you study Indo-European comparative religions, you will find that the Greek pantheon, with Zeus as the head, sounds eerily familiar to the pantheon of other Indo-European peoples. In fact, the father god, the sky god, was known as Deus Pater in the earlier Roman tradition. which they presumably got from the Etruscans. So Deus, Zeus is very similar. Those words are basically the same word, pater. So it's the idea of God as a father. Interesting. So the leader of the gods being more of a father figure. Now, the other piece of all this is that if you look at the mystery religions, they all have the shape of a Messiah story. The one we know the best is the story of Isis, Osiris, and their son Horus. And I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but that is a recurring pattern, and it recurs in many civilizations. Some less Trinitarian, but more with the theme of a returning God. And this is most evident in the legends, mythology of the Hindu Vedas, where they talk about, the sixth, seventh incarnation of Krishna, or of Rama, or of Vishnu. And there is a fair amount of argumentation, even in the Vedas, about, whether somebody is an incarnation of which god or continuation of an earlier god's incarnation cycle. Okay, so with that background, the other thing that is not clear to many Christians is the fact that the association between Christus and Messiah was only made in the early Christian writings, at least the ones that are survived. The origin of the word Messiah had nothing to do with Christus. It was rooted in the Old Testament, the Jewish Torah, which definitely, absolutely was talking about a Messiah of the Jews, of the Jewish people, the 12 tribes, the conquering Messiah, which is an outgrowth of perhaps older legends of a returning hero, but was very focused on this hero that was going to be the savior of the Jews, whose two kingdoms had been successively destroyed, first by the Assyrians and then effectively by the Romans. And so if you only view this story from a very short-sighted standpoint and don't step back and look at the whole Indo-European background of the idea of Christus, of Messiah, the returning God or demigod, you're missing out on the most fundamental, oldest part of the story. Okay, and this is where my take comes in. In point of fact, the whole story of Christianity, of Jesus coming back and being just one initial event and a recurring event, is quite limited in scope. It's basically a reimagining of the Savior Messiah of the Old Testament, as instead of being this conquering hero, somebody who's going to conquer through love and forgiveness of sin. Now, if you define Christ in that way, an Antichrist would be somebody who maybe makes you pay for your sins, maybe requires some service for get out of sin-free cards. And this gets at the root of why there is so much conflict about this idea of Antichrist. Because if you're one of the tribe that has bought into this idea that if I believe in Jesus, all my sins are forgiven because he died on the cross to forgive us all for our sins, you are buying into a very dirty lie. I'm sorry, but I have to tell you this. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's not why we're here. That's not what it's all about. What I'm telling you it's all about is reincarnation and karma. The Hindus got more right in that than most others. Now, they kind of lost their way somewhere along the path by making it about, well, my karma is better than yours because I'm of the high class. I'm the high caste Brahmin that's descended from Brahma, from the souls that have this essence of the main god. And that's essentially how the caste system got created. And that's just another myth of oppression. I'm working a myth of oppression that humans have created to misuse the spiritual revelations they've had for their own gain. And to that extent, it's very similar to what the Catholic Church did with Christianity. This forgiveness of sin bullshit is a very nice fairy tale. It's like, oh, okay, you can get away with anything, but as long as you believe in Jesus and his representatives on earth, we can arrange forgiveness. And this turned into the system of buying indulgences from the papacy. That was one of the chief corruptions that the Reformation sought to end. That, nobles were going off and fighting each other and committing basically genocide against peasants and getting forgiven on their deathbed by making a big donation of property or whatever to the church. Oh, you're forgiven now. All your sins are forgiven because the priest or the pope or whoever has blessed you. And it also is behind what we all know is a very common occurrence of people living very, very bad lives, doing a lot of negative karma things, and then on their deathbed they have an epiphany. Oh, I praise Jesus, I'm saved. And they go to their reward thinking that they've bought their way out of sin by doing that. This is a dark deception. It's not healthy. It teaches lack of personal responsibility for our actions. And we know where that leads. It's a very dark place for people in positions of power, but it's a dark place for people on the lower level too. Because if you're a peasant, a Christian peasant who feels oppressed, you feel perfectly justified in going and slaughtering your lord or anybody you think might be part of the class that's oppressing you. And this is related to my previous day's topic of why the Catholic Church is inherently Marxist in its thought and scope. It creates oppressor-oppressed narratives that can be played either way, which is the way Marxism works. Modern Marxism just stretches the definition of oppression and oppressor and oppressed so that you can make anybody into the oppressor or you can make anyone into the oppressed just by selling it culturally with the right narrative. And this is exactly what goes on if you look at especially historical TV series and movies. Over time, you will see that the same exact characters show up again in different series over the years and with completely different messaging, different ideas of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's the oppressor, who's the oppressed. Okay, so this is the essence of what we're so conflicted in about this idea of Christ. So let me clarify what the anointed are. This is the truth of the mysteries, the real mysteries. This is the truth behind these secret societies that tried to keep civilization going, despite all the bad things that were being done by greedy, selfish, powerful people. This is the essence of all the old secret societies. They started with this idea of working in the background to try to maintain some semblance of order among humanity, to give time for an event to unfold. Now, what is that event, you ask? I can tell you exactly what it is. This planet, this galaxy, this universe was created for the express purpose of developing a government for souls. Souls being independent consciousnesses, created in God's image, not God, not a copy of God, not a part of God, but an independent thinking apparatus, disembodied thinking apparatus. That's what a soul is. That's what the spiritual world is. Without the physical limitations, pure thought can do anything. And it did anything. And this was a source of much creativity, but much negativity, because if you've got a bunch of brains thinking up ideas and never actually trying to put those ideas in practice and seeing if they work or they don't, if which idea is better than another, you end up with innumerable conflicts that can't be resolved. And this is the origin of the war in heaven, which was the state of things before physical creation began. So how does one solve this problem? Well, this war in heaven devolved into pretty much two main camps that would kind of jockey back and forth for position. One camp was based on the premise that each soul had certain inalienable rights: the right to free speech, free thought, free creation, as long as they didn't hurt anybody else. That was the original idea behind karma. But there was no way to punish anybody for a sin at that point, other than just to point at them and say, "You bad guy, we don't like you." And that just amped up the conflict. The other side was of the mind that the only way to rein this in was to pick one supreme soul to be a dictator and tell everybody what to think, when to think, and take away all this free will and free thought that was causing so much trouble. And that camp centered around a soul that I call Borg, because that brings, in modern context, the best idea of what this other team was all about. And these two groups couldn't settle their argument. So how did they settle it? They decided upon the plan of physical creation. Well, what is physical creation but the embodiment of souls in a limited environment? This is what our physical universes are all about. Putting a soul in a soul vessel that has certain limitations. And different soul vessels have different limitations. In its first incarnation, it started with two volunteers. Well, one volunteer and one forced volunteer, if you will, the other side, embodying the first physical universes, the first bounded systems of experimentation. One representing and integrating the best ideas of the God team, and one instantiating and representing the best ideas, best is a relative term, of the Borg team. And so, just generally the goal was for the God universe to come up with the best of all possible training systems for souls who gravitated towards free will, independence, freedom. Now, not all souls felt that way. Many souls were perfectly happy with somebody else telling them what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And God, as a very understanding father, didn't put them down for that. That's fine. If you choose a choice, then your best training system is in the Borg universe. You'll learn to find your place. You'll learn to follow orders. You'll learn to do what you're told, or you'll be punished in Borg's universe. In God's universe, you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. You learn to take responsibility. You learn to own what you do. This is how things work in God's universe. Now, these universes didn't run independently because souls could incarnate in either universe, and frequently did, because Borg quickly found out that most of the good new ideas were coming out of God's universe. And even if they were dangerous ideas to an authoritarian, they were useful ideas, useful technologies that would help to get more souls under the power of the great authoritarian Borg. And similarly, God's team found that, some of the implementations of ideas in the Borg universe actually were kind of useful in the God universe, sort of as a devil's advocate to ideas. If you've got a good idea, how do you know it's a good idea unless you throw all the evil at it, all the dark, negative things at it you can think of to prove if that idea works? Okay, this is the basis for all creation. That pretty much takes us, with a lot of twists and turns in between, to the end of the 6th day of creation described in the Bible. What I've got to tell you now is the 7th day of creation is not what you were told. It wasn't when God rested. It wasn't all perfect at that point, and God went off to the celestial golf course to go enjoy watching his children torturing each other. That's not what happened. And anybody who studies the Bible knows that that is the fundamental problem with biblical scholarship, that the only way to interpret that is God doesn't give a flying fuck about these people on this planet Earth and enjoys their suffering. In fact, even sometimes causes it. And who would want to worship? Who would have any respect for a God like that? Except somebody maybe that is so guilty they feel like they need punishment. And there were many who went into church with that idea. That's how some of these monasteries got set up, who based a lot of their practice upon torturing themselves. Dies Domine, dona eis requiem. This is a thing. The flagellants were a thing. They would beat themselves to show how devoted they were to God. Now, how dark can you get? And this is all part of the heritage of the Christian church. You cannot deny the dark side of it. And it's that dark side that makes this idea of Antichrist so fraught. Okay, so who is the real Christ? Well, integrating what we know about what I've just told you, which is perfectly consistent with all science. If there's any scientists tuned in here, tell me that a creator, a spiritual creator, would not experiment and come up with the constants that produce all the structures and all the order that we find in our universe. Tell me that what you see around you was the result of random choices of what is the speed of light? What's the Planck constant? What's this? What's that? Tell me that that makes more sense than experimentation, perfection. Exactly what you do when you try to have a new idea and put it into practice. Why would God be any different? Why would the universe work any different than the individual human being? Where's the efficiency in that? Where's the sense in that? Okay, so once we get to the seventh day, that's where we need to really diverge from the biblical story. God was not testing. God was testing, not resting. What does that mean? Okay, so imagine if you were the first soul and you were firmly committed to the idea of free will, even for the darkest souls that wanted to dominate other souls and tell them what to do and be a micromanaging authoritarian ruler of the multiverse. You would allow them to do that. You would arrange things so they could never actually overthrow you, but you would set things up so that this dark side served the light in the end. And that's exactly how this system works. The dark souls are trained, grow up to serve dark purposes in the multiverse. They're the ones that take the karma for a supernova, destroying a bunch of star systems with prototypical life on them. I was just following orders, man. Those are the stormtroopers of anti-God Borg. So what I'm telling you is that part of this system, selling this system to all souls, all these old souls who grew up at the same time God did, with in this world of pure spirit, pure thought, you can't force a system on them without breaking your own commandment, right? Overthrowing their free will, their free choice. You got to sell them on the idea. And this is what God did. God was the best salesman ever. He talked them into, after, well, they didn't have time then, but what was an effective elevation of frustration with this conflict in heaven, talked them into the idea of solving it by testing in these physical worlds, which is essentially what we do when we want to make a new microprocessor. Okay, you want to make a Pentium 22. No such thing. They don't use the Pentium moniker anymore because that came about in the generation of 5, and we're well beyond that, right? But or if you want to come up with Windows 12, okay, you take what's existing. You don't just change everything you want to change and throw it out there and let everybody fall all over themselves finding the bugs. You create a test environment. You do this for hardware, you do this for software. Anybody that's involved in hardware development or software development knows that testing is the most important thing. And if you're developing hardware, especially, testing in a simulation environment is extremely important because it's very, very, very costly to put things in hardware and then make changes. You've got to go through a whole process of making a new set of masks, a new set of templates for that hardware to use in the fab so you can make this new circuit, even if you're only changing one wire. And you don't want to have that cost for every single little change. So you create a simulation environment. That's effectively what the physical universes are, a very, very sophisticated simulation. And this is where The idea behind the Matrix is essentially right on track, but it's a very dark view of what was going on. The view of us being in a simulation that is punishing us, feeding from our energies, that's the Borg part of the simulation. The one that is keeping people enslaved, that wants to harness their spiritual energy and use it for their own purposes, that's the Borg universe. Okay, so there is truth in that, but it neglects the whole truth of the other side. The universe side of it, God's universe, is all about freeing us to do responsible creation with the understanding that our creations can harm others, can cause pain and suffering. Now, it may be that pain and suffering is in the physical world, and it's not going to affect you permanently because you're a soul and you reincarnate, and the spiritual world is the real world. But in fact, emotional trauma, pain and suffering causes emotional trauma that is very much a spiritual thing and is going to stay with you through multiple lives, even if it was only a product of participating in one version of this simulation. Now, that was not known to these folks at the time. When God sold this, he sold it as a video game, just like we sold our first virtual realities. The metaverse that Facebook and others are trying to draw you into are basically repeating what God did in the spiritual world, trying to suck you into this fun world where you can do anything, you could wield swords, you can become any avatar you want to, and they're not telling you there's consequences, are they? No, that wouldn't sell it. They don't put a warning label on things like that. So this is essentially what God did or didn't do. He sold them on the idea of let's test our ideas in this game. And at first the game was like early video games that we're familiar with in our culture. Like Pong, where your avatar is like a little thing sliding back and forth, and you're hitting a ball, which is kind of like your enemy, or your weapon, and then the blocks you're trying to break through are the enemy. Okay, and that's a very impersonal simulation. And this whole game started out as very impersonal like that, with basically the souls throwing planets and galaxies and so forth around at each other, trying to make bigger galaxies, better galaxies, new materials, new elements, new chemicals, in teams or alone, kind of as a giant erector set, kind of like we do if you've ever played the game of life and its latest incarnations. I just found a new one, mobile game that was a very advanced version of the game of life, where instead of just having little dots representing organisms that could reproduce if they got close together and might die if they were apart, it has organisms that take on the characteristics of various forms of life, various organizations of matter. There are simulations like that work at a cosmic level, and they definitely try to map to the latest laws of science as we know them. And absolutely, if your religion, if your spiritual beliefs don't mesh with what is measurably provable in science, you're living in a fantasy. This physical universe is a reality of form. In a sense, it's a virtual reality, and it has laws and structure that you cannot change. And this is why I throw so many darts at these folks that believe in this so-called law of attraction. You cannot make your own reality manifest independent of all the other souls around you. until you get to be a senior level creator like God. Then, if you advance to that level, you will have your own universe of creation and be able to actively set it up. You'll be essentially a game designer yourself. And at that level, if you don't mind working in a universe where all the souls are virtual, knock yourself out. You can create anything you want to when you get to that level. But that's not something you can just say, I'm going to think I'm at that level. This is as insane as the idea that Jesus is going to forgive you for all your sins. This is bullshit. It doesn't work that way. And it's a dangerous way of thinking. And dangerous thinking is what Antichrist is all about. Because the way that spiritual energies get taken by the Borg side is through despair. Raising one's hopes up and then disappointing them is the best way to get souls in a position to be conquered, to be taken over, to allow their spiritual energies to be subsumed by some more experienced soul and used for their purpose, which they may sell as something very good. But I'm telling you that that is a karmic sin, using other souls without their knowledge of what they're being used for or why, manipulating them, controlling them, stealing their spiritual energies. This is the essential karmic sin. To God's side. Okay? To Borg's side, the biggest karmic sin is not doing what you're told, not obeying God's orders, God's laws, God's dictates. And this is why the Bible is so confusing, because it has both points of view in it. Why? Because this is how the Christ game works. The Messiah game is how we all get a chance to become anointed. The real meaning of Christ, this anointed, says that you are a servant. You are following the path of your chosen God, which at the highest level leads to the first soul, the real God, or this faker, Borg, who runs the universe of authoritarian control, the micromanaging almighty power behind the Borg universe. Okay? So, how does this game work then? And why is there so much energy around, well, if anybody can be a Messiah, then why do we have the idea of one Messiah? Okay, here is the thing. The way this game was set up is anybody that knows anything about doing simulations knows that you have to define completion criteria. When have you simulated enough? Because you can, in a very complex system, you can run simulation, hit it with test cases till ad infinitum, and at some point you've got to decide, when is this good enough to call this version of this simulation done? And the way that happens in God's universe, I'm not going to talk so much about Borg's universe because I don't care about that universe. That's not the one that I participate in. That's not the one I'm going to be participating in. I am a free-willed, free-minded, responsible creator. I take responsibility for everything I've done, good or bad, happily. I don't mind pain and suffering because I know if I have any of it, I'm going to learn from it. That's what being in God's universe is all about, learning from our mistakes and learning to be a better creator, a more responsible creator. If that seems too hard for you, go live in the Borg universe. Go become the oversoul of a mountain. Become the oversoul of a grain of sand. It's an easy job. You're not going to feel a lot of stress. Well, unless you're involved in an earthquake or you're hit by an atomic bomb and you melt. That might be somewhat painful. There are a lot of soul vehicles to be involved in. And if you're not a creator, if you're not a responsible creator, you don't belong in a God species, which is what humanity is going to be and what this event is all about. Okay, let's get back to the seventh day of creation. So what is going on here? The completion criteria for this day of creation revolves around testing and perfecting the laws of reincarnation and karma through the latest chosen species, humanity, to the point that these laws are ready to transmit to the rest of the galaxy. Now, they're not perfect yet, but they're good enough. How do we know they're good enough? Well, here's the completion criteria that God has decreed for the seventh day. The reason God hasn't been around here is God has been testing the system personally, been reincarnating, getting to start out in a human body or some other alien species on another planet, wherever, getting to start out as a plant, getting to start out as an animal, as a dinosaur, and experiencing what the latest version of reincarnation and karma was like, what that experience was like, what the world looked like from a moral standpoint, how well it was, how easy it was to embody the principles of God's universe and to resist Borg's universe if you wanted to. How easy it was to make this fundamental decision, which side you want to play on. And there's no right or wrong point in this decision. And there are many people, I think you know many of them, who are perfectly happy living in an authoritarian society where you're told what to think, when to think it, how to think it, you're told what to do, what's good, what's bad, what you should major in college to get a good job, how you should behave in your job so you can get a promotion, etc., how many kids you should have. If you want that kind of environment, you belong in a system kind of like communist China, which does all those things. They regulate how many children people can have. They regulate how much money they can have. They regulate their careers. This is how just recently they took their big exam, yearly exam, and they changed this exam. They changed the questions and the difficulty to match how many jobs are available and what kind of jobs are available, so that the ones that don't fit into their current idea of what we need, what is necessary to the state, are going to fail. And they'll be stuck taking the sloppy leftovers of the state's blessings. And this is how their system works. It's harshly utilitarian. It's highly authoritarian. If it doesn't serve the state, it doesn't serve at all. And of course, it's very nepotistic and it's very corrupt, because power is by nature a corrupting force. This is what God has known from the beginning, and why God allows Borg to exist and allows people to decide to play on one side or the other, but sends so many prophets, so many teachers trying to help people discover and take responsibility for themselves before they fall down this dark path, because it is a dark path. Granted, many souls are going to fall down that path, and it's a necessary thing. You need souls that are going to be a grain of sand for eternity. But they shouldn't be punished by becoming human when they can't handle it. That is punishment. If you're incarnated in a human form and you can't handle all the choices, all the decisions that you have as an almost God species, that's punishing somebody. That's punishing a soul. It's like holding out an apple on a tree that you cannot possibly reach. That's the ultimate punishment. And that's what Borg does, is gives you the chance, the idea that you might be God when you have no chance of doing it. That's not what God does. That's what Borg does. That's how Borg disenchants, gets souls into a state of despair where they're willing to give their soul to his team to use for whatever purpose they will, and take some joy from being part of a, quote, winning team in the battles that they happen to win. They do win battles. It wouldn't be a fair war if the bad guys didn't win once in a while. That's how the good guys learn how to be better at being good. And this is the truth of duality. This is why all sane religions have some sense of duality. This is also why there's such a conflicting idea of it, because selfish versions of duality, the us versus them versus God against Borg conception of duality, pulls you into a dark and negative piece of it where your little battles become more important than this bigger battle going on. Okay, so the seventh day of creation is all about God personally reincarnating and experiencing karma, experiencing making mistakes, experiencing pain and suffering, just like every other soul does. And this is the truth of the real Christ. Now, there are other senior souls incarnating, so it's not always clear which is the incarnation of God, which are the incarnation of other souls on God's team, which are the incarnations of souls of Borg or souls on Borg's team. And there lies the confusion about Antichrist. Okay? The Christ is the incarnation of God that is going to drive the completion of the seventh day of creation. And the definition of the victory conditions, the operating conditions, for the eighth day, along with other senior creators that are working at the same level as God. Because God is not an authoritarian monarch, micromanager of the multiverse. This all exists as a co-creation. It always has. There is not one creator. There is not one creative force. The oneness concept is absolute nonsense. The one God concept is absolute nonsense. It only serves the Borg side. And that's not what creation is about. Creation would never have happened if Borg had won the battle in heaven. You would have had one soul that subsumed all the thought and energy of every other soul and existed as a singularity of consciousness. Now, some of you who believe in this oneness source nonsense, that's what you think is you want. Oh, this is wonderful. I'm going to be part of the one. You're nuts. And I don't mind telling you that. You are never going to win this battle. And you are not part of One, you're part of a Borg collective. A useful idiot to your Borg collective. And all Borg collectives are, by definition, part of Antichrist. So the Antichrist ultimately is the incarnation of Borg himself. Herself, itself. There was no sex at that time. So let's not get into, gender dysphoria with this discussion. The Christ, capital C, is the incarnation of God. When an incarnation of God happens, and God gets to the highest level of spiritual attainment, which even God doesn't always get to. God has incarnations where doesn't even get past first base. Many of you are experiencing that in this current lifetime, that it's really hard right now. This is a special time, a very difficult time. Why? Because Borg knows that the battle's almost over. In fact, it is over. I'm here to tell you that the real Christ, capital C, God's incarnation, has incarnated on earth and has seen where we're at, what humanity has accomplished, and said, you know what? This is a proof that it works. Why? How do I know that? Because of where we're at in AI and virtual reality. We are to the point of creating exactly what God and the other disembodied souls created to test their ideas. This metaverse concept is exactly the same thing. Ipso facto, if a chosen species can rise to the point where they implement what God had envisioned when he inspired all the souls in heaven to set out on this plan, it's ready to implement. Oh, sure, there's going to be minor patches and bug fixes, but we're ready to roll this sucker out. And it's already a done deal. The pain and suffering remaining is what needs to happen to get ready for the 8th day of creation. What has to happen for that 8th day of creation to get going? Well, when you're testing something, you want to throw every possible corner case, every possible condition at it that you can to make sure that it doesn't fall apart. If you're testing a system of karma and reincarnation, you want every shade of light or dark soul, every kind of passion, every kind of temptation, every kind of sin that you can imagine to be manifest and allowed to play out all the different scenarios that could be played out on. And I think you're seeing around you that is exactly what has happened, especially in the last 100 years, as technology has just catapulted us into this area of the unknown where things are changing so fast, we have no idea what it's doing to any individual. And it's creating all these weird new paths that souls can take that human incarnated souls never had to face before. We all know this challenge is happening around us. We just don't necessarily know why. And that's why some of the dystopian ideas of what's going on, like the Matrix, are taking root. But it really is the completion of this testing. And this is happening both in this universe and the Borg universe. I don't know what Borg's conditions for perfection in their universe are. I don't really care, because nobody is obligated to play in anybody else's universe. And this is the end game I'm going to tell you about, where you need to place your hopes, even if you're set on going down the Borg side, which many of you are. Many of you have succumbed to, you know what, I'm just going to go along with whatever's happening here because I can't fight this anymore. I get that. And that's a choice. And it's a choice you can change with time, but it's going to be more difficult to change than it has been because we don't need souls that aren't able to handle being part of the God species. And that's what humanity will become. When God on earth dies, and he will, that will signal essentially the day of judgment. What does that mean, judgment? It's not what the Bible tells you. It's basically going to be a sorting of souls. There are some souls that will get to continue to incarnate in humanity, in other God species that are working for God, other God species that are working against God, Borg species, anti-God species. Those will be two groups of souls that will be sorted. The largest group of souls is just going to incarnate somewhere else. Maybe there's some other species that's just exiting the Stone Age on some star on the other side of the galaxy. Maybe they haven't attracted the attention of Borg yet, but they're in Borg space. And yes, there are parts of the galaxy that are dominated by forces. It really is much like the Star Trek universe. There are factions out there on both sides that are either not aware of the Borg God, the economy, and they're playing out their own conflict fantasies like the rich and powerful of this species do here on this planet, who are unaware of higher powers. Or they're aware of it and they've made a decision consciously as a species to Borgize themselves or not. Now, how do Borg species organize themselves? They organize themselves as hive minds. Okay, that happens with organic species and inorganic species. The whole idea is that they work on technology to be able to control minds, to control action and thought remotely. That's not something that a God species playing on the God side would do. That's an anti-God action. It carries heavy, heavy karma because it's basically technology that is directly in violation of the prime directive of karma. And that's a choice that they make. And we are going to have to fight battles against species that have made that choice. Those battles will take on a much more spiritual tenor than the Star Trek mythology. Because what essentially is going to be happening is we are going to be invading those other species with karma. Karma, in its latest version, is kind of like a virus. This is what our species was developed for. This is why so many pieces of DNA were combined and refined and resulted in this thing we call humanity. We are not the same as the God species who contributed to our creation. And both God and anti-God species contributed to that creation. In fact, the first hominid species was a Borg species. Walking and having hands and that was necessary, a necessary adaptation to allow androids to function on this planet and not be affected by what was the current version of karma, which was actually developed by plants. Who were the ones that sent out the spores that seeded the first Borg worlds. It's battle that's been going on a long time. And it is absolutely rooted in this idea of organic, inorganic, AI, natural, what's free thought, what is controlled thought. And this is another reason you've got to know that we're at this end time right now. Now, you may think that we've lost the battle, but I'm telling you that we won this one. What's going to happen is as people die off, after God incarnate dies off, which he will, then they will go to a different heaven, because heaven is part of the karma system. And there is not just one heaven, there is a different set of heavens that are looked over by all the new gods that have come into existence as a result of this system. Some of the heavens are dark heavens of war, and one might be forgiven for calling those hells, because they will put you in a spot where you either have to become one of the Borg leaders, be as cold and ruthless as you can to get to the top of an authoritarian structure, or you will be used and abused. That's the far side. There are other universes that I kind of view as vacation universes, fairy tale universes where souls can choose an incarnation and just live in kind of a nice, happy unicorn rainbow fairy tale world for a while, where nothing really happens. There's nothing really creative going on there. The laws are set up in such a way that nothing is very stable, because if you choose as a god to have laws that are different than the scientific laws that have been cobbled together in God's universe and are used in Borg's universe as things that can hold together for long periods of time, aren't just a short-term fantasy. Okay, this is what the universes are like of, for instance, Tolkien, a great writer, became a god after he died. He made a contribution that was worthy of godhood. His universe is Middle Earth, or whatever Middle Earth has transformed into under his particular direction since. Now that he has much more creative power, much more ability to actually put in place this Middle Earth and test. And who knows, maybe he'll come up with a version of Middle Earth that becomes more permanent, that has a longer timeline, has a more definite beginning and end. And this is the essence of what a universe is, what a god is. God and Borg have the most stable universes because they are the first. This universe pair were the first, but there are other universes out there that have been grown up within this system and are more or less stable in proportion to how closely they map to the universes that have created the longest timeline so far. The longest timeline gets set every time God incarnates and says, this is good enough. Let's put a timestamp, or even not good enough, but this is a good starting point, a good save game. This is another way you can kind of view it as a game, very similar to our video games. A timeline is a save game of a beginning and a likely end. The midpoint is the save game. Time before that is pretty well fixed, and it's almost impossible to change anything in the past from that midpoint. The future is less fixed, but is fixed enough that those souls who will come into existence in the future can take some amount of active role in ensuring that they will actually eventually exist. And this is why I tell you that Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is also another very, very good movie to get familiar with. It's kind of a campy idea, but it is true. And there are visitors from our future, from a Borg future, from a God future, trying to manipulate the situation. And this just makes the game more interesting. This is why souls want to play this game. They've been drawn into it more and more. At first, they were just throwing planets around and building galaxies, and creating new isotopes and stuff like that. Now it's like every soul is completely engaged in the system, even if they haven't tried it. There are many souls still up in the spiritual plane who've not been brave enough to incarnate, but they are watching what's going on down here. It's become the most interesting reality show, and they have their favorites, and they have, my God, I want this future. I'm going to go down and play on that team. I don't care what happens. And this is ultimately how we get everybody to play the game, to play new versions of the game voluntarily, even though they know that they're starting to figure out that God's team is eventually going to win. Now, what does winning mean? It doesn't mean you kill the other side. It means the other side is all isolated in their own universes, which, because of the way spiritual energies work, their universes are going to be separating from God's universe. At some point, we will have enough God energy in God's universe and enough Borg energy in Borg's universe that they will split, and these two original universes will no longer be so intimately intertwined. And it won't be so easy for Borg souls to come into God's universe as anything but the pieces of it that nobody wants to play, the NPCs. Nobody really wants to spend an eternity being a grain of sand. It's kind of boring. There are not many choices. Well, maybe some do, but mostly those positions are going to be filled by virtual souls. What are virtual souls, you ask? Okay, so this is the one exception to free will. A virtual soul is a level 0 soul who has no consciousness yet, but they are called in to play a part in a universe as a stand-in for a real soul that is participating in another universe. This is how we have parallel universes. There are multiple copies of a soul in other universes, but there is only one that is the real copy of that soul, the one that's at any level but 0. Okay, these level 0 souls are bound to do what their soul was going to do with their particular makeup, their particular frequency signature, modified by what is required of that universe. So if you're a virtual soul in God's universe, you're going to keep acting and behaving like you would normally have done, unless what you're going to do interferes with God's plan. So if you're a soul that was going to get drunk and get in an accident and kill a top scientist or a top artist that was going to develop something that was furthering the plan, that was essential to getting this 7th day over with as soon as possible, with the fewest souls being pulled over to the dark side, to the Borg side, you will be replaced by a virtual soul, and your original will go off to another universe. How does that work? Well, every soul has their own universe. If you aren't attracted to anywhere else when you are winked out and replaced by a virtual soul, then you go to your own universe. You do your particular thing and then wink back in, after the event is over, and it happened in one universe and it didn't happen in the other. That's the most common occurrence for low-level souls, because you haven't really defined a strong frequency attractor frequency to any particular universe other than the one you're currently playing in, which hopefully is God's universe. As a soul develops its own character, its own characteristics, and gravitates more towards the Borg side or the God side, then their universe will become more substantial, and they'll spend longer amounts of time in their own universe. When a soul rises to the God level, then their universe is essentially permanent. They may not realize it when they're in until they reach the highest God level, but anything they do creatively, if it is not consistent with the laws of physics, with the laws of the established timelines of God and Borg, will be done in this alternate universe inhabited by virtual souls, mostly, and any souls that happen to want to play your game with you. And there are many souls. The great goddess has gone by many names, but I call her Lilith, the female demiurge. Is a very popular soul, and her universe is very popular. Her universes, because she's got many copies who have grown the image. And this is why there are so many different manifestations of the female goddess. The triple goddess, they called in the oldest traditions, because one manifestation was as the old crone, kind of the wicked witch manifestation of the goddess. The other was as the wifely matron, the one responsible for the family, childbirth, and the young maiden who would attract all the young gods and lead them to their destruction. And the goddess has positive and negative aspects. There are goddesses who have universes all along the spectrum from God to Borg. The one that represents this love, light, and oneness idea, to the extent that it is non-authoritarian, runs a universe pretty close to God's. I would call it an R&R universe. Okay? It has many pieces of it that are inconsistent with being effective, active combatants against Borg. Universal love is a very dangerous concept. You don't give an authoritarian micromanager universal love unless you want to have a monster like Xi Jinping or Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler run your country. And that's what inevitably is going to happen if you support the rule of one power that says that they're going to bring peace and love and harmony to everybody. You'll get anything but. And this is why those souls are not going to be allowed to stay in God's universe on God's earth or participate anymore in this version of humanity. Now, there is another version of humanity in that alternate universe that you can incarnate into, and you can live kind of what I call a vacation life. Like I said, it's a place of R&R for souls that have become very damaged by the war. You can heal for a while, and everybody there is going to be very warm and greeting and helpful. And this is one of the heavens that is attracting a lot of souls right now. There's nothing wrong with that. But, and this is a big but, this is not God's universe. Okay? At some point, that universe produces souls that are more susceptible to being taken over by Borg. They have weakness. They have openings that the dark side can use to get into and wedge them into a dark place. And this progression of universes from the very, very God-supporting goddess to the very, very Borg-supporting goddess. You might think of as Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and death. That progression is one that is easy to make if you identify as female. And there's a similar progression with the various versions of gods that have come from the male demiurge, Lucifer. Lucifer and Lilith are two names you need to get familiar with because they sort of represent the original souls that started the two universes. They have incarnated many, 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 many more times than God and gone through much more pain and suffering in the process of developing these rules of reincarnation and karma. And there are versions of them that are in the whole continuum from God's universe to Borg's universe. This is not a bad thing. This is what gives souls the sorting ability of redemption. This continuum, once those universes are separated, the two original universes are separated, this will be the only path back to God. It will be the only path to Borg. And souls will keep sorting themselves until the universes will be individual gods with their own plan, or individual gods with a plan based upon any save game of either Borg or God, trying to come up with a better solution from that save game and sell it to either God or Borg as, this is an improvement to the timeline you had. Well, I got this thing to happen sooner, so the midpoint can come here and we can move the beginning backward or the end forward, because the whole idea of creation is creating the longest timeline. For Borg, it's the longest timeline that keeps Borg in control, command and control of the most powerful authoritarian universe that has its hooks into as many other universes as possible. For God, it's creating the most free creation, free and responsible creation, the most beauty, the most sustainable beauty, the most extensible beauty. And that's the other path. And they both serve each other in giving an idea of where you might want to play. As a young soul, you come into existence in any universe as a result of now becoming a virtual soul, a replacement for a soul that's moved to another universe. So maybe you're replacing a soul that's moved more towards God. Maybe you're replacing a soul that's moved more towards Borg. And this is exactly why so many of you are just adamant that you don't believe in God, because you are very, very either virtual souls yourselves or very close to having been a virtual soul on your early incarnations as an independent soul. Now, virtual souls don't stay virtual. As a reward for them playing out the scenario of the end of this life in a certain universe, they get rewarded with the opportunity to be a full-fledged soul and choose an independent life in a universe that is consistent with the energies of that soul. So it's going to be kind of a related copy of the original, but be on its own path. And that's why there are so many different goddesses, so many different gods, which have resulted from this human experiment, which is a continuation of many other chosen species experiments. There are many, many, many gods and goddesses and I don't know what you call a neuter God, or a God in species that have multiple sexes. Let's just call them all gods. They have their own universes. Many of the universes are based on an old version of karma. The oldest being that, it's kind of the honor system, which we know how well the honor system works with souls. Souls have egos. I'm sorry, folks that believe in the Buddhist bullshit. You cannot kill your ego. There is no such thing as ego death. This is an illusion. It's a very dangerous illusion and a great delusion, because the folks that are teaching this are basically creating their own little authoritarian bubble of worshipers. And this is why you've got gurus and monks and guys like the Dalai Lama who are supporting them, encouraging them to spread their happy little platitudes and lies. And, while the world is going to shit. I'm sorry. This is a cop-out. You cannot kill your ego. You can delude yourself for a lifetime that you are, but I guarantee you're not heading for nirvana. You're avoiding your karma, not eliminating it. And karma is not a bad thing. Karma is what teaches us what stuff we are made of. If you want to avoid it, if you're into the avoidance philosophy of the East, this is not real. My ego's not real. I just need to empty my mind and meditate to nirvana. Okay, you know where you're going to end up? You're going to end up in the heaven of the first Buddha or somewhere nearby. And I guarantee you that is not anywhere near the universe of God or the universe of Borg. It's like in this wishy-washy place in between, where you can sit and do nothing for as many lifetimes as you want to. If you call that nirvana, checking out of the multiverse, selfishly deciding, I'm not going to play the game anymore. Fine. Welcome to it. I'm just telling you where you're going to be in the multiverse. You're going to be in a place of non-players. And it's no fun being in that place when you get to the point that nobody wants to serve anybody else. What happens to the Buddha when nobody wants to follow him anymore? Nobody wants to go take on the karma of killing his food and bringing it to him. Nobody wants to be a servant forever, especially not gods. And that's why this whole idea of one God that's your ultimate servant is so stupid. Dumb, dumb, dumb. God is another soul just like any other soul. God has his own interests, his own desires, his own things that he would like to do. And those have changed, absolutely changed drastically throughout this seventh day of creation, when he's gotten to experience incarnation in all sorts of different species, including this very interesting species of humanity. Has learned to have preferences. God wants to have some time in his own universe to just chill. That's why he's happy that there's all these other universes. If you want to come play in God's universe, knock yourself out, but just don't piss God off, because he's tired of dealing with a lot of the shit that the children have come up with. God deserves a break. And actually, the ultimate day of creation will be when God finally gets to take a real break, finally gets to rest, because there are enough creative universes that he doesn't have to worry about doing anything but putting the final rubber stamp on any major change, the next major change that comes up, that the children decide need to be elevated to his level of approval. Ultimately, God is what all good managers are. He's trying to put himself out of a job. This is the truth of God. And anybody who knows what good leadership is about, what a good creator is all about, knows that they don't hang on to things. They want to let go. Once all the fun of creation is done, yeah, you want to have a decent life, but you want to move on to what you want to do next. If you look at the good creators, this is what they all come to once they get past their terrible teens. This is where folks like Elon Musk are heading. This is where the greater scientists, the greater artists have all round up. The greater leaders of history get to a point where they don't want to be the conquering hero anymore. They want to be in as stable a situation as they can with trusted lieutenants that can take over so they can devote their time to what they want to devote their time with. Their closest family, their biggest interests, etc. Anyway, this has been a little bit longer than normal, but I think it gives you a more clear picture of what Antichrist is, what Christ is, and how you can choose whether you want to be an Antichrist or a Christ in what's going on today. I have to tell you that most of you have already chosen, and it's not a digital thing. It's not I'm Antichrist or I'm Christ. It's a continuum. And that continuum is going to define, in general, where your soul is headed. If you've established a very strong resonance with one of these other universes, that's probably where you're going to be playing your next game. After you die, you'll go to the heaven of that universe, and your guides there will direct you towards choosing an incarnation in that universe. Those of you who have demonstrated a potential for being, let's call it being a good soldier of Christ, are going to get to stay in God's universe, because that's the universe that needs to have the Borg influence purged out, to have creation perfected to the point where the positive resonance of this universe is so strong that Borg type souls cannot get into it. They're so distant. That's the only way we're ever going to get to the point where we can have truly creative souls, responsible creators, working with total freedom. Their creations not being misused and turned to the dark side. It's not going to happen until we do that. And this is why we need this system. This is why it's going to take so long. This is why there's going to be at least 12 days of creation, if not more. It can't be any other way unless you want to give in to Borg and have an authoritarian micromanager decide everything. And this is not a winning solution for creation. It is going to create a very, very fragile and destructive creation that will implode on itself. Just as all authoritarian regimes on this planet are imploding and will implode eventually when people get tired of everything coming from the top down. What to think, what to do. You can't run things that way. Power needs to be distributed. Power needs responsible use, needs to be limited, needs to be regulated at all levels. You can't give all the power to the people. You can't give all the power to an oligarchy or one individual. It does not work. Anybody who thinks that if only my side had the power and we could dictate everything is a fucking idiot. No matter what side they're on, no matter what their politics, no matter what their religion. And I don't mind telling you that or calling you that. You are an idiot if you think that way. And you do not belong in God's universe. At least not as a God-level species, a God-level incarnate, in a God-level species incarnate. because you are dangerous if you think like that. And dangerous people need to be isolated, not killed. Killing is not a good idea. It causes pain. It causes hardship. It terminates an incarnation against somebody's will. Now, we may have to do that because there's no other way to separate them, to get them out of our society. And there may be situations where killing is still the only way to solve a problem. But it is correct. That is a sin. If there's another way around a problem without killing, we should try to find that. So there's still a lot of good to be found in the Ten Commandments. These things need to be respected. The emphasis on the family, on the community, on a hierarchy of responsibility for children is very important. And if you try to mess with that, you are mucking with the natural order of God. And you are headed for Borgland because you're an idiot. These laws have come into being for very good reasons because they worked, because they created a stable society that allowed our species to survive several near extinction events. And they will survive this next one we're heading for. At least some of our species will survive, and it's not going to be the ones who are scrambling to get on the last dick-headed rocket ship. At any rate, this is Rob Trump for the Omnist Hour. I'm sorry this was a darker segment, but I think it was one that had to be done. And I hope you will find it useful and instructive. Till next time, like, share, subscribe, and tune in again to the Omnist.